Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Jeff Peterson looks at corn and soybean prices. AG Kawamura talks about food security and water availability. Greg Kruger discusses Marestail Control, and Brad Lubben gives an update on Farm Bill discussions. Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The U.S. Department of Agriculture released its latest supply and demand estimates Tuesday. The agency didn't make changes to U.S. corn ending stocks, but it did increase soybean ending stocks by 10 million bushels. More notably, the USDA bumped the size of Brazil's soybean harvest by 3 million metric tons. The harvest there is now expected to be 111 million metric tons, or about 4.1 billion bushels. That would be the world's second largest soybean crop ever produced, behind only last season's output in the U.S. We talked with Jeff Thursday morning and started by asking about the projections in South America.
You know, when the Brazil report came out, a lot of bushels coming out of Brazil, Jeff. We ended up seeing 80 million more bushels on the corn side, 110 million more bushels on the soybean side. So that was a lot of bushels for Brazil, but we also ended up seeing Argentina increase also. We saw a 39 million bushel increase coming out on the corn side, only an 18 million bushel increase on the soybean side. All of that could be attributed really in Argentina to the yields, but on the corn side, a lot of that came from more acres, a lot more acres being planted to that second corn crop, the safrinha crop.
Before we talk about U.S. S&D numbers, tell me what's happening on the world scale.
Yeah, and interesting, you know, when we saw these big production numbers come out, as we start first on corn, the demand side, we saw a nice increase in corn demand, 125 million bushels, but that still gave us 91 million more bushels of ending stocks. That was about a 1% increase. As we dig over and look at who's going to use up that corn, a lot of bushels, you know, China's sitting there in the number 2 position at about 22%. The U.S. still is at the top at 30%. And then from there we work through the EU and then on into Mexico, Brazil, and then ultimately end up coming in last into India. Over on the bean side, though, that's one that's built a lot of stocks, Jeff, and that's going to kind of keep a lid on these prices because we only increased demand 26 million bushels. As a result, ending stocks came up 5.5%, 169 million bushel increase in ending stocks. And as we'd expect, China's at the top of the heap to be the one that's going to use it, you know, along with the U.S. and Brazil and Argentina in that order. So.
Back in the U.S., ethanol production was increased by 50 million bushels this report. Can you tell me where the strength is coming from?
Yeah, you know, a lot of it because of the problems that they had in South America on the corn production last year, and also because we ended up seeing the sugar price go up higher. As a result, they didn't produce as much, and we've had a good market importing, or basically sending exports and allowing them to import the bushel. So that's been good demand for us. And we've also are gearing up for that time of the year in the driving season where we're going to have more gasoline demand. So there's been a lot of good blending demand there also on the ethanol side.
How much focus is on the weather across the Corn Belt right now?
It's everything's being talked about, Jeff. That's the big thing. And as we dig into the weather, I think first thing we have to look at is kind of the planting progress and set it up. 3% planted, you know, that's not much. We've got some key states that haven't got started. That's not a lot different. Last year, 4%. Really the past 5-year average, about 3%. But whatever has everybody's attention really would be the 6 to 10 and the 8 to 14 day forecast, which does show a lot of precip and a lot of precip actually for not only parts of the western corn belt, but also the eastern corn belt. And that's got people a little bit nervous as we go into the season. We can't say that it's going to be a crop we're going to have a lot of prevent plant yet, but that's something that's got everybody talking.
Update me on where fund positions are.
You know, right now, and this is a good position to actually have the funds in. When we make our weekly adjustment in here, what we're showing is the funds are short about 156,000 contracts on corn. Now, they were shorter more than that last year. They were short about 223,000 before they started moving higher. So if we get a little weather scare here, they're going to have to buy back through some of those shorts, which that's a good thing. Over on the bean side, we show them even. And so at this point on the beans, they could still go either way at this time.
I should have mentioned you do have some guys that are already going in the field.
There is a few guys out there. You know, as we look around different areas, as you go into south central Nebraska, some of those are guys getting rolled. And believe it or not, we've got a few guys that are getting close to being done. Now that's very, very few and a very, very sparse, but there are some guys out there that are running. But we've got other parts of the areas that we cover, Jeff, they haven't even really thought about getting going yet at this point.
Everybody else just sat up when you said they're almost done.
Oh, I know.
Okay, markets go where from here, Jeff?
Well, this is a nice setup. If I was just purely a technical trader, I'd be sitting there, I'd be saying I want to buy corn and I want to buy beans. And then I take into account the weather and look at that also, and that also helps make me a little bit friendly in regard to the bean market. So we think that the market's actually got some room to start working its way higher here on both the corn and beans for old and new crop both.
You said if you were a technical trader, explain what the technical signals are right now.
Yeah, what the technicals did, Jeff, when we came out of that crop report, we actually had a strong down move in the soybean market, but immediately that day we did close actually higher. And then, so we look at a couple different technical indicators, the stochastic and then also the moving averages, and both of those ended up throwing a buy signal. So that gives us the indication or some confidence that the funds are going to want to kind of step back here and buy some of these bushels as we go forward, especially with a wet forecast.
Next week, North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson will join us to look at corn, soybean, and wheat markets. A.G. Kawamura was the final speaker for the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Heuerman Lecture Series Wednesday. A.G. spoke at the close of this week's Water for Food Global Conference held at Nebraska Innovation Campus in Lincoln. A.G. served as California's Secretary of Food and Agriculture from 2003 to 2010 and currently owns and operates Orange County Produce in Southern California. We talked with A.G. Tuesday on Innovation Campus about water resources, food security, and how urban agriculture differs from what many farmers are used to here in the wide open areas of the Midwest.
Well, just by scale alone, you've got tremendous differences in the logistics of how you might be farming. If you're on a single piece of ground, you may rent a tractor, or you may try and repurpose a vacant lot. I mean, it's so night and day different, even though it has a lot of similarities. So the way we would look at it in urban agriculture, the way we're practicing it in our area, we're still the same rural farmer that we were once upon a time. We farm on about 800 to 1,000 acres, depending on the year. Urbanization came and surrounded us in all areas, and so we're still farming on a large amount of acreage, but on a lot of different little pieces. And we go around looking for vacant lots, for example, and if the weeds look good, you know it's a good piece of ground. You look for the fire hydrant if there's water, or a connection for water, and if you have those two, you realize you can step right in and take a 5-acre piece, a 4-acre piece, or larger, and that's actually a viable piece of acreage that you can turn around, repurpose, and farm.
What role does urban agriculture play in solving the challenges of food security?
Well, you know, we always say you can't feed the world from a rooftop. So there's rooftop gardens, there's community gardens, there's community farms, there's local farms, urban farms, there's indoor production systems, and they are all growing tremendously. They are part of a food system that can augment the regular global food system or the regional food system. And because a lot of those new technologies allow for basically a zero seasonality. In other words, you can grow them any time of the year because you're controlling the seasonality inside a building or inside of a hoop house. It allows you then to also create a different kind of market space and a different kind of continuity of product. So with fruits and vegetables, and that's of course where my background is a lot, is focused, it opens the door for maybe looking at a year-round production system all in the same spot, whether you're in Minneapolis or Phoenix, Arizona.
So I've listened to some of your thoughts on this before, but why do you think we haven't solved the challenge of food security across the globe?
Well, it's kind of a simple answer to that. We have the capacity to feed everybody on the planet right now. Our challenge is, will we have the same capacity to feed everybody 10, 20, 30 years from now when the population increases up to 9-point-something billion? But do we have the will to feed everybody becomes more of a political policy question. And it's not so much a logistical problem as it used to be 50 years ago. The logistics are easier, the ability to move food around, to get food to certain places. There's a tremendous famine threat currently. Actually, it's a reality in Africa, for example, right now. In that case, there's a will not to allow certain people to have access to food. And so our world really revolves around two things. Can we maintain the capacity and improve upon the capacity so we have a predictable food supply? And then can we tremendously improve upon the will to make sure that everybody on the planet has something to eat?
When we talk about the resources needed in the future of agriculture, where does water rank among those that you're more concerned about?
Well, it's interesting. We're here at the conference for food and water water for food security, and it seems so simple, but you know, water is for living. If we don't have water, we don't have good water, usable water, the whole agricultural endeavor can collapse on itself. Now, it's one thing if you're rain-fed, and so much of the world's food supply is rain-fed. It's over 90% in Africa. Here in the Midwest, I believe it's over 80% is still rain-fed agriculture. I'm an irrigated agriculturalist. I'm a farmer that turns water on and off the way I need it, when I want it, how much I need, and I'm able to fertilize accordingly. So there's such differences in the way you look at the ag infrastructure around the planet, and for so much of the planet that is still vulnerable to shifts in climate, shifts in water patterns, rain patterns, or heat patterns. It's our biggest challenge is how resilient can we be adapting and anticipating some of these, say, water insecurities.
What areas in agriculture do you think over the next 5 to 10 years we should focus on, policy or otherwise?
Well, I think there's several. In our own country, but it's global as well, you have to have an infrastructure that works, whether you're delivering water, cleaning water, servicing water, and if that system is built out of a 20th century or even a 19th century backbone, it needs to be upgraded. Deferred maintenance is not helping the world think it's going to have a good future. We need to understand that where water is available is not necessarily where it can be delivered to. California is probably a good example of putting water into odd places that you thought you couldn't grow in, and yet when you create an infrastructural improvement, suddenly you can't believe how much productivity can be achieved. So with the tendency to say that, okay, what is the solution set that might fit a problem? I think that's where our excitement might be right now, is that there's just a lot more tools in the toolbox. We have a much more robust toolbox than we had 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Just think 100 years ago. It's unbelievable where we are today. And then that then gives us a chance to rethink what's possible.
AG's full presentation from this week's Heuermann Lecture Series can be found through a link on the Market Journal website. The USDA's first planting update shows U.S. farmers have sown 3% of this year's corn crop, on pace with the nation's 5-year average. Texas leads the nation with 59% complete, followed by North Carolina with 10%. Neither Nebraska nor Iowa had recorded a percentage. To look ahead at potential challenges in the 2017 season, this week we talked with Nebraska Extension's Greg Kruger about controlling Marestail. It's one of several weeds resistant to glyphosate in Nebraska, and a recent study illustrated just how widespread that resistance is. Greg joined us in studio Tuesday. We started by asking for a background of Marestail resistance in Nebraska.
The first glyphosate-resistant weed we had was Marestail. We're still dealing with it today, unfortunately. It's one of those that I consider pretty much ubiquitous, Jeff. It's everywhere. So just about anywhere we see it, we're going to be dealing with it. And it's primarily a no-till weed, so if we're out there tilling up the ground still, which is pretty uncommon, we're probably not dealing with Marestail, but most of our other places in the state, there's a high probability that it's something we could end up dealing with.
You've done some sampling across the state to try and find out how widespread the resistance problem is. Tell me the story.
I'm trying not to smile on this one because it's really not a great story in terms of what we're dealing with. But when we collected over 150 populations from across Nebraska, brought them back to our greenhouse and screened them out for resistance, we found 98% of them from row crop areas were glyphosate resistant. So it's one of those that not only is the weed pretty ubiquitous in the state, if we're dealing with this weed in row crop areas, we might as well consider it glyphosate resistant. So we're going to want to manage appropriately because of that.
But in non-row crop areas?
Yeah, so that's a whole different story. We did some work there as well, so we collected another 50 or so populations there. And actually, interestingly enough, even though 98% of them in row crop areas are resistant, not a single one of the populations that we collected from non-row crop areas were glyphosate resistant. So it's, I guess, a little bit of a story of hope that if we go away from using glyphosate, that tool might actually become a tool back in our arsenal to manage Marestail at some point in time.
All right, tell me about the emergence patterns here of Marestail.
Yeah, so when we talk about Marestail, it's always important to keep in mind the biology. It's a little bit different than managing a lot of other weed species. We've found that we'll actually germinate 10 months out of the year here in Nebraska. January and February are just a little too cold here, but the rest of the year it's seemed to find a way to emerge, and because of that, we've got to be proactive in how we manage it. Most of what we see emerge is going to emerge in the fall, and so we want to make sure that we're getting out there in the fall as soon as the combines come out to try to get ahead of it. Or if we can't do that, then there's situations where we just can't get out in the fall. We want to be out there first thing in the spring. Marestail is one of those that once it starts to bolt or it starts to grow up, it becomes much more difficult to manage than when it's in that little rosette form that it's going to overwinter in.
So if we're this late in spring, what are your control options? At
this point in the spring, we want to make sure before we plant the field that we've done everything we can to put down some sort of a burn down, heavy burn down. In a lot of cases, this means going to something like paraquat, which is not real exciting to our growers because of other issues that we deal with that herbicide. But something like paraquat, certainly a 2,4-D or dicamba, as long as we've got enough of an emergence window before we plant soybeans. Going into corn, not a problem. If we're going dicamba tolerant soybeans this year, that opens up a little bit of a window to use that tool a little bit closer to planting than what we have in the past. So those are certainly probably the best options we have herbicide-wise today. Tillage is still a great option for management of Marestail. Not that I'm promoting tillage across the state of Nebraska, but certainly for the management of this particular species, that's an option we've got in the toolbox as well.
Next week, Nebraska Extension's Lauren Giesler will join us to discuss fungicide applications in soybeans. While the current legislation runs into next year, Nebraska Extension Policy Specialist Brad Lubben says conversations on what would be the 2018 Farm Bill have already begun. The Farm Bill contains several programs, including crop insurance, conservation, and commodities. The biggest chunk, about 80% of projected spending, goes to nutrition. We talked with Brad Tuesday and discussed the potential futures for each of those programs.
Well, this Farm Bill process is underway. We know the Senate Agriculture Committee held a field hearing back in February. That was sort of the initial kickoff. But the House Agriculture Committee and all of its subcommittees have followed with a series of hearings as well. And we've sort of heard from every major interest on this Farm Bill process already. Lots of issues on the table, but obviously lots of work yet to do.
Let's talk about a few issues here. Let's start with crop insurance. Is it any safer this time around?
One would look at crop insurance and know that last time in the 2014 Farm Bill, we actually added to it, so we strengthened it. We did put some additional demands on it, particularly in terms of conservation compliance. But it is still the major item in the farm income safety net. And as one of the 4 big ticket items, one of the 4 big bank accounts in the Farm Bill, it's always a target. And that'll be work that the ag community really has to push forward here in the next couple of years to see this through to the end.
What changes with the commodity programs?
On the commodity programs, you have, remember, the crop programs as well as particularly the dairy program. And almost in all cases, there's general satisfaction with the direction of programs, but there are all kinds of requests for changes. Reform the way the ARC program works, the Agricultural Risk Coverage Program, that is the moving average revenue safety net. We know there are discrepancies in payments across counties. That's really by design. That's how the program's supposed to work. We know that there are some issues with data, yield data, that affect some of those payments and discrepancies that may be addressed, but definitely there's a tweak here, a tweak there that producers seem to be looking for. Even on dairy, we shifted fundamentally from a price safety net to a margin safety net in the 14 Farm Bill. While that concept is still attractive, dairy producers are arguing that the current equation and calculation isn't sufficient. And so everybody's asking for some improvement in how it works.
Senator John Thune this week from South Dakota suggested that perhaps they could scale up the CRP enrollment.
Right.
Is that realistic?
Well, that's yet another one of those asks. Here's the conservation title, another one of those 4 big bank accounts. And the CRP program has shrunk in the last 2 farm bills, largely following the market. The market encouraged more land into production out of the CRP, so we shrink the CRP cap to save money. Now we're in a market climate where we'd like to put a little more land into the CRP, but the cap has to be raised. Just like asking for changes in commodity programs or elsewhere, raising the cap has a budget cost to it, and a fairly substantial one. So that's one of the major asks as well.
Do you think that's a stretch? Do you think it's realistic that the CRP enrollment, the target, would go higher?
Clearly, there are lots of interests and lots of motivation to push the target higher. You have support in the environmental and conservation, as well as wildlife communities, and you have support on the agricultural community or the agricultural groups that see the potential supply and demand effect.
I think the discussions about splitting the nutrition program away from the agriculture program, it's quieter now than it was. Maybe you disagree, but is that something that some senators or congressmen are still looking at?
There is certainly pressure to look at splitting them again. The same interests that pushed a split back in 2013 when it actually was split in the House, but then it was passed and separately and pushed back together. The same interests are there to split from both the far left and the far right, and there may be even more impetus this time around to try and find a way to rein in the budget, and that involves a strategy of divide and conquer. But for every agricultural group, and for most of the farm or of the food and nutrition groups as well, the coalition, they've learned how valuable that coalition is, and most of the sort of advice around the table thus far has been the necessity, the importance of keeping them together. We know the nutrition title is the biggest title, even for as strong as that coalition is. We also know that the ag groups can't expect to find money there to fund something else. That's a sibling relationship that nutrition needs its component as well.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. Before we get the main forecast, I would like to thank Stony Cooper for subbing in to me. I had to make a quick trip back to Michigan, and what I will report is got back from Michigan during the middle part of the week, and what I did notice was we had excessive amount of moisture across most of northwestern Indiana, western Michigan, and the eastern half of Interstate 83, northern Illinois. Lots of ponding of water. As you move westward, things could dried out considerably, but soils were still wet. Now we've added a couple precipitation events since I've returned, so I suspect that they are starting to get a little juicy in locations, which may actually alter the ability to get out in the fields and plant in a timely fashion. With more systems coming down the pipeline, it looks like they're going to be in for a very wet period over the next 2 weeks. For us, same thing. We're looking at numerous opportunities for precipitation with a couple strong events within this 7-day period. So as we go to the upper air models, the first, of course, precipitation event that we'll be dealing with is for today. As the system moves across the northern plains, there is another piece of energy moving through the southwest flow, which will generate a surface low basically over the Texas Panhandle, bringing moisture up into our region. So the precipitation that we see moving through eastern Nebraska today probably will come to an end tonight as the system moves up into the upper Great Lakes region. That allows a ridging temporarily to build in for Easter Day, bringing mostly sunny conditions to the entire state with increasing clouds late as this low pressure system starts to move toward the northeast. That will actually push some moisture up into our region late in the day and maybe even clipping southeastern Nebraska before we start to turn our attention to the west as a series of upper air lows begins to move its way through. The first one generates the low pressure system, once again the Texas Panhandle. That begins more of an easterly track, bringing most of the precipitation across eastern Kansas and points into the mid-Mississippi River Valley with a little bit of precipitation possibly in southeastern Nebraska. Then we see a much deeper trough starting to dig in, starting to see low pressure organize in the Intermountain region. We will have a temporary break here in terms of precipitation across Nebraska, but we will start to see this moisture filtering very rapidly across the central Rockies and filtering into Nebraska, particularly as we get into Wednesday. As we start to see this trough digging, we got cold air behind it. Two surface lows will start to congeal across the western high plains. That spreads the moisture across western Nebraska. As we get into the day on Wednesday evening, and then as we go into the day Thursday, this shield will start to move its way east in response to the upper air low itself moving its way toward the Great Lakes. So we have a deep fetch of moisture with this system. Two areas of low pressure system. The more significant one is across southern Minnesota. That will generate a substantial shield of precipitation with potentially a mix of snow or all snow up in the Dakotas. This trough continues to deepen, shunning most of the moisture to the east of us as we get into the day on Friday as these low pressure systems make their way up into the Great Lakes region. So we're going to see another widespread area of heavy precipitation basically from eastern Iowa to the Great Lakes with some thunderstorm activity potentially in portions of northeastern Oklahoma into the southwestern Missouri. Now as we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast for next Thursday through the following Tuesday, we can see that we're right at the northern periphery of the above normal temperatures with a cold pocket over the Great Lakes in terms of precipitation. Another series of low pressure systems will move across the country, bringing a well above normal moisture most of the northern half of the United States with significant moisture potentially across portions of Iowa and points to the east.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean prices, urban agriculture, Marestail Control, and the 2018 Farm Bill. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Next week, Frayne Olson will be our grain market analyst and will discuss research on corn stalk lodging. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.